On a cold winter morning in the year 208, the fate of an entire civilization hung in the balance along the banks of the mighty Yangtze River. What happened next would shatter the dreams of one man, save two kingdoms, and split China into pieces for the next 3 centuries. This is the story of how a single battle changed the course of Chinese history forever. Picture this. The most powerful warlord in all of China has just assembled the largest army the world has ever seen. Cao Cao controls the entire north, commands hundreds of thousands of troops, and stands just one river crossing away from conquering everything. His opponents? 2 desperate rivals with barely 50,000 men between them. The smart money was on complete annihilation, but here's what nobody saw coming. By the time the smoke cleared and the flames died down, that massive army would be fleeing through muddy roads, drowning in their own retreat, and the dream of reuniting China would be dead for centuries. The Battle of Red Cliffs didn't just decide who controlled the South. It rewrote the entire political map of the world's most populous empire and created a power structure that would define Chinese civilization for generations. Now, before we dive into how this impossible victory actually happened, you need to understand just how close China came to being unified under one ruthless warlord. The year 208 wasn't just another year of warfare. This was the endgame of a collapsing dynasty, and Cao Cao had positioned himself perfectly to pick up the pieces. The Eastern Han Dynasty was dying. Corruption had rotted the government from within. Rebellions were erupting across the empire, and powerful warlords were carving up territories like a feast. While most of these regional strongmen fought petty wars against their neighbors, Cao Cao was playing a different game entirely. He systematically conquered rival after rival, absorbing their armies, expanding his territory, and building what would become the most formidable military machine in Chinese history. By 208, his conquest of the north was complete. Every major city, every strategic position, every rival warlord had either been defeated or had bent the knee. Cao Cao wasn't just another ambitious general anymore. He was the de facto ruler of half of China, commanding resources that dwarfed every other power combined. And now, standing on the northern banks of the Yangtze River, he could see his final prize within reach. The Yangtze wasn't just a river. It was the lifeline of Chinese commerce, the natural barrier that separated north from south, and the key to controlling the entire empire. Cross the Yangtze, defeat the southern warlords, and Cao Cao would become the undisputed master of China. Fail, and his dream of reunification would be nothing more than another footnote in history. But crossing wasn't going to be simple. On the southern banks waited 2 desperate men with everything to lose. Liu Bei, a distant relative of the imperial family who claimed legitimacy through bloodline, and son Quan, a young warlord who had inherited his father's kingdom and military genius. Separately, neither stood a chance. Together, they represented the last hope of preventing total domination by Cao Cao. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in human history. An unstoppable force was about to meet what appeared to be a very movable object. The smart money was on the northern juggernaut, steamrolling the southern resistance within weeks. After all, numbers don't lie, and Cao Cao's army outnumbered the Southern Alliance by at least 4-1, possibly 8-1, depending on which historical accounts you believe. What nobody anticipated was how the southern commanders would turn their greatest weakness into their most devastating weapon. Zhou Yu and Zhuge Liang weren't just going to fight Cao Cao head-on. They knew that would be suicide. Instead, they spent weeks studying their enemy, looking for any crack in his seemingly impenetrable armor. And what they discovered would change everything. Cao Cao's massive army wasn't just big, it was suffering. These northern soldiers had never fought on water before. They were getting seasick, falling ill from the humid southern climate, and struggling with diseases that spread like wildfire through their overcrowded camps. The very size that made them so intimidating was becoming their greatest vulnerability. But here's where it gets brilliant. Instead of seeing this as a minor advantage, the southern strategists recognized it as the key to total victory. Cao Cao, desperate to stabilize his seasick troops and give them a fighting platform, made a decision that seemed logical at the time. He ordered his entire fleet to be chained together, creating stable floating platforms that would allow his men to fight as if they were on land. Picture hundreds of warships, all connected by massive iron chains, creating what essentially amounted to a floating city on the Yangtze River. To Cao Cao's northern army, this felt like salvation. No more rocking ships, no more vomiting soldiers, no more chaos. His men could finally organize, form ranks, and prepare for the assault that would crush the southern resistance once and for all. Zhou Yu looked at this chained fleet and saw something entirely different. He saw the perfect target. The plan they devised was so audacious, it bordered on insanity. They would load unmanned ships with oil, straw, and anything else that would burn. Then, they would set these fire ships ablaze and let the winter winds carry them straight into Cao Cao's chained fleet. If it worked, the Northern Armada would become a floating inferno with no way to escape. If it failed, the Southern Alliance would lose their only chance at survival. On the night of the attack, everything had to align perfectly. The wind direction, the timing, the courage of the men who would guide those fire ships as close as possible before abandoning them to the flames. One miscalculation and the entire plan would collapse. The fire ships struck just after midnight. Carried by perfect winter winds, these floating bombs slammed into Cao Cao's chained fleet with devastating precision. What happened next was beyond anything the southern commanders could have imagined. The flames didn't just spread from ship to ship. They exploded across the entire armada in minutes. Remember those chains that were supposed to provide stability? They became death traps. Ship after ship erupted in flames, and with everything connected, there was nowhere to run. Northern soldiers threw themselves into the freezing Yangtze rather than burn alive. Those who couldn't swim drowned. Those who could swim froze to death in the winter waters. The floating city became a floating crematorium. Cao Cao watched his invincible army disintegrate before his eyes. Decades of conquest, hundreds of thousands of troops, the dream of reuniting China under his banner, all of it consumed by fire in a single night. But the nightmare wasn't over. Zhou Yu launched his land assault while the northern forces were still in chaos, smashing what remained of Cao Cao's army and sending the survivors fleeing north. The retreat became a massacre. Heavy rains had turned the roads into rivers of mud. Exhausted soldiers collapsed and drowned in the muck. Disease spread through the retreating columns faster than the men could march. Those on horseback trampled their own comrades trying to escape. By some estimates, less than 10% of Cao Cao's original army made it back to friendly territory. In one winter night, the course of Chinese history had been rewritten. The Battle of Red Cliffs didn't just save Liu Bei and son Quan. It guaranteed that China would remain divided for the next